Thanks, Josh. And I'll just quickly share my screen. Sorry, I can't be with you guys in person today, but hopefully you can see my slides okay. So yeah, this is a study that we were commissioned to do by the UK's Commission for Countering Extremism. And it's part of a larger project that we've been doing in terms of kind of an online scan in terms of kind of online extremisms, non-violent extremism in the UK, sort of pre, during, and post-pandemic. So we've been working quite closely with data science team here at Anglia Ruskin at the Policing Institute. Me and Elisa kind of head up the extremism and counter-terrorism strands. So be kind of reporting some of the findings that we've had from this more direct project looking at anti-government threats in the UK from these groups. So in terms of kind of just conceptualizing, we're looking here specifically at non-violent extremist groups, and what we like to term kind of vocal extremists, sometimes termed as hateful extremists. So these groups that don't obviously carry out any kind of specific violent threats or acts, but through their kind of discourse around maybe revolution or bring down the system, that they might also issue other calls of action and develop grievances that inspire other people to go on and commit either unlawful or violent acts of extremism. So we can think about international examples here around like Anders Breivik's support of the English Defence League, for example, and also the Christchurch shooter and his kind of admiration, as it were, for kind of identitarian groups in Europe. And so in terms of, let me just move on. In terms of the study itself, we looked at three different groups from three different ideological buckets. We're quite keen to look kind of cross-ideologically in this space because we know how hybridized extremism has become. So we looked at Cage, specifically their Facebook and Twitter. We were lucky in some instances because of, let's say, the change in ownership of Twitter. Patriotic Alternative, which previously had a home on Telegram, were represented very briefly in our sample. We literally concluded the study as they were taken off again. So as researchers, we were very grateful for that. And then in terms of third category, eco-radicals, we looked at Extinction Rebellion, both of their Twitter and Facebook. Obviously, Patriotic Alternative haven't had any real presence on Facebook, so we had to discount that. And what we were kind of key to look at is the narratives. So what threat or anti-government extremist narratives were present, especially in appealing to kind of new recruits, maybe kind of a populist appeal related to that, especially in regard to kind of stoking resentment towards government measures in relation to the coronavirus. Then we were looking at kind of some of the similarities. Could we see any similarities or differences? We were also looking at kind of broad recruitment. We made this distinction, which we can discuss later, in terms of hard and soft. So more direct appeals versus more indirect ones. We've seen groups like Patriotic Alternative using things like kind of gaming nights, kind of movie screenings, and other kind of community building activities that don't kind of overtly suggest the sharing of propaganda, but we know to involve kind of the furthering of particular kind of extremist or radical worldview. And then finally, we're keen to also include this bucket in terms of some of the offline effects, to see whether we've seen any mobilization due to the online chatter. And we tried to do that at a more quantitative level. Hopefully, if we go on to do future projects, we'll be able to do a bit more of a qualitative deep dive, but I'll present some results in terms of that. So in terms of the techniques, we used some computational data collection in terms of scraping the accounts, but also in terms of processing the data mainly using kind of topic modeling around the narrative, so breaking down different elements of the group's ideologies, and doing kind of broad counts, and using computational methods to populate those counts. We also constructed protest events data sets for the time period, which was 2019 to 2021, for all three groups. Again, to try and see what was the kind of offline spillover. And we developed obviously a code book for a bit more of a qualitative deep dive, mainly as a kind of sense checking, but also to see what in terms of the actual kind of see what was kind of going on under the surface, and focus here is mainly in the UK. So in terms of the kind of key narratives that we're focusing on in this study, were mainly kind of four. One was around strong states and anti-democratic sentiments. This idea that kind of all man-made laws and systems of government, including democracies, are illegitimate, as they're kind of, even in the case of more Islamist groups, not grounded in Islamic law, or in more far-right groups, kind of don't help to kind of forward and preserve the white race, as they kind of term it. Then we have narratives we're looking out for in terms of specific animosity towards the UK government. So the manifestation of direct animosity towards employees / leaders of the UK government, and or UK government institutions. Then we also looking at this other aspect in terms of historical events and analogies and figures. So using of these mainly in a kind of conspiratorially defined way to justify some of the kind of extremist ideology and the rationalization. And finally, manifestations of kind of direct animosity towards UK law enforcement and law enforcement agencies. And we used Elisa's great three-part kind of structure of these narratives of extremist groups around an enemy to fight, victims to protect, and change to achieve. One thing we were kind of keen to point out in the study was to kind of suggest that a lot of these groups don't have an overt anti-extremist ideology. We can say that they had some kind of grievances and sentiments, but this is kind of perhaps far away from US-based groups that we've seen that take a more kind of malicious style modus operandi, and use the filter of kind of anti-government ideology or more sovereign citizens type kind of ideology to put forward their claims. They still have their kind of core ideological narratives around kind of the Islamist, the far right, and the eco-radical kind of elements of their ideology, but this is something that we've seen kind of emerging in terms of trying to kind of leverage on these appeals. In terms of that, it tends to take this more kind of populist kind of tinge to it, with the use of narratives of fear and paranoia to appeal to new recruits, such as kind of anxieties around the government monitoring citizens, or that the government is kind of involved in this secret plot against them. And this kind of manifests itself different in terms of different ideology. So in terms of eco-radical, this might be the impending doom of planets, in terms of far right, the end of the white race, or in terms of the Islamist side, a more virulent abuse of power by Western elites that might lead to kind of elimination, at its kind of most extreme. So we wanted to make kind of clear that this is kind of different from more legitimate critiques of government, because I think there can be this kind of blurring of that in this space. So we're only really looking at groups that kind of actively call for the overthrow of the system. They're involved in insurrectionary violence and revolution, and this kind of It's evident in all three of the groups that we are looking at. So yeah, I've already kind of outlined this in terms of recruitment. So this is from the code book. I won't kind of go into too much detail. It's just basically some of the indicators that we use for different forms of recruitment. And then in terms of the protests events database that we constructed, overall we coded for 289 events. Cage had most on during the time period, with Patriotic Alternative and Extinction Rebellion having slightly less. And I'll talk a bit in a moment about some of the differences between the different groups and how they mobilize offline. So in terms of Cage, we analyzed obviously both their Facebook and Twitter posts during this time period. But I want to draw your attention to the orange part of these pie charts. So those were the ones, the posts that we coded, which had overt kind of, the specific kind of animosity towards government. So across the two platforms, we observe the group kind of boldly attacking the UK government for Islamophobic stances and policies allegedly targeting the Muslim diaspora community. And the group's use of the term kind of often uses the term Islamophobia industry or lobby to refer to institutions, think tanks, research centres, mass media and influential personalities who were determined to have targeted Muslims as a suspect community. So Cage portrays a kind of conspiratorial hidden agenda of this Islamophobia industry in order to annihilate Muslims and relegate them to fringe of society. And more precisely, there's kind of keen focus, as you can see from the word clouds generated from the postings on Twitter and Facebook around the prevent strategy and also the war on terror. Now, just going forward in terms of the offline, what we saw there in terms of kind of geographic concentration was that they're mainly kind of concentrated in major kind of UK conurbations in terms of the events that they were holding, mainly in London, Birmingham and Manchester, a couple in Liverpool. And so these events had a kind of variety of different rationales, the main kind of being within the kind of core focus ideologically of the groups, but also kind of also a significant number there in terms of ones that were kind of, I guess we coded them like critical of kind of law enforcement, specifically kind of the deployment of kind of security apparatus. In terms of just moving on, because I know I've only got 5 minutes left. In terms of Patriotic Alternative, again, quite about 30% here in terms of Twitter postings involving some sort of specific animosity towards both UK government and law enforcement. We kind of combine those measures for this bit of the analysis. And that was around a kind of strong anti-system, anti-coronavirus and anti-lockdown rhetoric during the time period. We saw quite a lot of talk about conspiracy theories around the Great Reset, and suggesting that the global elite were using COVID to enforce some sort of radical change or new world order. Finally, we saw that there was kind of some examples of insurrectionary calls to action. So on July 24th of 2020, for example, one tweet kind of praised and hoped that there would be a kind of accelerationism happening towards chaos, downfall of the system, at that summer's Black Lives Matter protests. And whilst others also kind of were engaged in similarly kind of dystopian or erosionary rhetoric around the UK's political asylum and education system. In terms of the offline picture, again, in terms of rationales, looking at the bottom of the slide, the kind of anti-lockdown element was kind of fair minority. A lot of the protests that the PA has been involved in tend to be around this kind of warning around kind of white marginalization, white genocide, and we, in terms of like the scale of these events compared to the two other groups, they were fairly small. So the majority were only sort of 2 to 20 people, often involving a banner drop. What's also significant and different is that most of the activists within Patriotic Alternative tend to be outside some of the major cities of the UK, tend to be more clustered in the northeast. Now, finally, just to round things off, in terms of Extinction Rebellion, I think what we found was interesting here was a more kind of sophisticated and perhaps nuanced and developed kind of critique and anti-government sentiments, and these were around kind of 3 micro-narratives that we identified. So these, but they were still quite a large proportion of online posting. So the orange parts of the pie charts kind of represent that, more on Facebook than on Twitter. And what we saw was within the kind of micro narratives was this kind of conjuring of kind of both kind of anarchism, this idea of kind of acting now, deciding together, and telling the truth were kind of key claims made by the group. Populism, kind of anti-establishment kind of rhetoric was kind of a key part as well, but also this strategy of civil kind of disobedience throughout the postings, this idea of kind of the need to be in rebellion, a kind of this fusion of individual identities with that of being kind of a rebel was quite core to a lot of their postings. And then offline, the volume simply was in terms of number of people protesting was simply off the charts. So if I go on to the next slide, in October 2019 protest, we saw this kind of strategy in terms of civil disobedience about people kind of actively going for arrest, and in terms of the numbers, quite simply kind of tens of thousands of people mobilizing compared to some of the minority of people involved in the other actions across the other 2 groups. So just to conclude then, in terms of conclusion, we did see evidence of specific animosities on Facebook and Twitter amongst all groups. In terms of how this translated offline, there's kind of a bit of variance there in terms of how it manifested within the claims of all the groups. We saw them all actively kind of using more kind of both soft and hard recruitment strategies, but all of them were able to kind of quickly readapt to the pandemic circumstances, trying to add this layer of kind of anti-government grievance and populism to as a bridge to their kind of core narratives, which still maintain kind of a key presence within their online discourse and propaganda. So thanks everyone for your attention. I'll now cede the floor. Thank you.
Well, thanks, William, for a very interesting presentation. We now move on to our second presentation of the session, participation in anti-authority protest and links with grievances, conspiracy theories and radicalisation. Our speakers today will be Anthony Morgan and Dr. Timothy Cubitt, on behalf of also their colleague Isabella Voce, and they're from the Australian Institute of Criminology.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Good afternoon, good morning. God, good afternoon, everyone. This is my first AVERT Symposium, and I'm really pleased to be here. And I want to thank Michelle and Lydia and the whole organising committee for including our work on the program. So together with Tim, you are just stuck with me, I'm afraid. Tim is here to answer the tricky questions, but I'll be doing the presentation. But Tim, our colleague Isabella Voce and I at the AIC have recently embarked on a new program of radicalisation research, and it's focused on a number of related issues. So this includes the participation of individuals involved in anti-authority protest and the role of grievances, conspiratorial and sovereign citizen ideologies, and the risk of radicalisation. Now, the particular piece I'm going to talk to you about today was undertaken at the request of the Five Eyes Law Enforcement Group in response to growing concern about the risk of community safety from anti-authority and anti-government movements. Now, I think some of the previous presentations have done a really good job of setting up our work and our presentation, but like many countries, we've had our fair share of protest activity in Australia since early 2020. So we, of course, in mid-2020, we had our own Black Lives Matter protest, protesting Indigenous deaths in custody. We had our Women's March for Justice protest in early 2021 in response to high-profile sexual violence cases. And, of course, we've had several fairly significant climate change protests, particularly around the big bushfires on the East Coast in the early 2020 as well. But of course, we've also had a lot of protest activity related to COVID, much of which has been timed around the introduction of different public health measures, be they anti-lockdown protests, anti-vaccination protests, or anti-vaccination mandate protests. Now, I'm not going to labour this point because I think Lydia in particular set this up really nicely, but what distinguishes the COVID protest activity from other protest activity during the same period has been its link with the broader anti-government social movement. So we know that malicious actors have exploited the pandemic to promote anti-government sentiment, often interlinked with conspiratorial ideologies. And these actors have sought to capitalise on the uncertainty and the discontent with public health measures, and really seeing it as an opportunity to fuel social division and pursue their political, social or ideological agendas. And of course, this wider freedom movement has been associated not only with protest movement, but as we've discussed before, with making threats against high-profile politicians and government officials. And another prominent feature of this movement has been its ability to unify an otherwise very disparate group of people. So it's brought individuals and groups together with extreme views, I think Lydia called them so-called average citizens. And this, for me, particularly close to home, was no more apparent than during the Canberra convoy, when, of course, we had people protesting a real grab bag of grievances, conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, anti-vaccine mandate, sovereign citizens, far-right actors, Indigenous rights activists, and ultra-religious groups, and so on. And of course, as we've just seen, researchers explored the collective action taken as part of this freedom movement. And there is also research into the mobilisation of this movement, or this action, including the role of the online environment and the central motives, ideologies and narratives associated with the, or that underpin the wider extremist movement. And we also know who some of the key actors have been. But this is a movement that's involved a large group of people, or at least we think it's a large group. We don't know how big that group is, but we know much less about who has participated in this collective action that forms part of the freedom movement, and the extent to which these individuals might actually be vulnerable to radicalisation. And this is an important gap, given the ability of an extremist movement to recruit, mobilise and retain a network of individuals who share their goals is actually really fundamental to the strength of that movement and its ability to achieve its political and social goals. And this has been the focus of our growing research program. And so in this study, we sought to try and fill this gap and understand who was participating in collective action in sort of connected to the freedom movement. We conducted a large national online survey, recruited from a number of research panels. And through this survey, we collected a lot of information about people's socio-demographic information, their online activity, experience of recent stresses, social and political beliefs, their access to fringe and radical content online. But we also asked them questions about their involvement in protest activity. We then also had an online moderated interview with a subsample of respondents who said they participated in an anti-authority protest. And this is really useful, both in terms of validating who was in our sample and some of their views, but also understanding their motives for participating, how they became involved, and also their response to the government and police response in particular. The sample we used for this study was designed to recruit people from around Australia who are broadly representative of the wider population. So, for example, the size of the sample in each of our states and territories reflects the population in each of those jurisdictions. Likewise, we wanted to try and make sure the sample was as representative as possible in terms of key population demographics. So there was a high concordance between our sample and the wider Australian population in terms of age, gender, employment, education, whether they were born overseas, and the level of remoteness. Nevertheless, I'm quick to point out we need to be cautious of generalising beyond our sample because of the limits of online panels that rely on non-probability sampling. Still, we can be confident with a large sample like this that we are capturing the views of a wide and diverse segment of the population. So what did we find? Let me start with our identification question. We asked respondents whether they had participated in a protest or rally in person in support of a political or social movement. For every 100 respondents, 19 said they had ever participated in person. Of those 19, 6 had protested since January 2020, which is kind of our period of focus. And of those 6, 2 had protested for the very first time. They hadn't previously participated in protests. We then asked those respondents who said they'd participated in in-person protests since January 2020, what issues they'd protested. The most common, as you would expect from my first slide, was environmental issues or climate change, followed by women's safety and rights, and the rights of First Nations people. Nearly 1/4 said they'd protested government policies on COVID-19, and 7% said they had protested the rejection of government authority. And there was a really significant overlap between these two groups, and we can't combine them to be our anti-authority group. In the analysis that follows, we compared our recent anti-authority protesters, who account for slightly under 2% of our sample, with people who'd protested recently with other causes, around 5%, with people who had protested before January 2020, but not recently, another 12%, and also people who had never protested, which is nearly 4/5 of our sample. Now, importantly, there's not really a clear division between groups who participated in different protest types. So half of the respondents who said they participated in an anti-authority protest said they'd actually also participated in support of another social movement or cause. Most common among this was environmental issues and climate change and women's safety and rights. And anti-authority protesters were more likely to say they sat on the right or far right end of a left-right political spectrum, but many of these protesters also describe themselves as sitting in the centre or towards the left. So, and I'll come back to this point, it's very much not a homogenous group. When asked about the most recent protest they attended, what concerned them about the issues or what they wanted to achieve, anti-authority protesters were primarily focused on demonstrating their desire for freedom from government overreach and upholding their rights, very much consistent with the freedom movement. They are also much more likely to be promoting the use of evidence and exposing government or media lies. They were less likely to say they were there simply to support or show their support for the movement, or to say that they were trying to influence government or shape policy. So how do these groups compare to, or how do these protesters compare to other groups? In order to develop a profile of anti-authority protesters, we turn to the best contemporary evidence about the risk factors for cognitive and behavioural radicalisation. So what we did was we drew upon the Campbell Review by Wolfowitz and colleagues, which identified more than 100 risk factors and protective factors for radicalised attitudes, intentions and behaviours. And in a recent study published by the ARC, slightly biased, Emily Corner and her colleagues used a very similar approach for analysing grievance-fuelled violence, adopting this kind of same framework. And so we identified a similar approach for ourselves, and we identified all of the risk and protective factors that were measured in our survey and whether they were related to radical attitudes, intentions, and behaviour. And these 30-odd factors form the basis of our profile of anti-authority protesters and our comparison with other people who completed the survey. And really what we wanted to know essentially was whether our anti-authority protesters were more likely to exhibit the risk factors or were less likely to exhibit the protective factors. And then we measured overall radicalised attitudes and intentions. Now, I'm not going to go through, don't worry, I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but what I want to do is illustrate how the profile of anti-authority protesters did vary by focusing on a select number of important factors. First, in terms of socio-demographic factors, we found that anti-authority protesters were more likely to have a history of military service and were more likely to attend attend religious worship on a regular basis. Anti-authority protesters were more likely to say they'd been arrested, charged, summoned, convicted, or had any findings of guilt for a criminal offence, either as an adult or as a juvenile. Consistent with recent evidence demonstrating their important role in grievance-fueled violence, recent negative life events were more commonly reported by anti-authority protesters than other groups. This was especially true for financial stresses, including reported increases in financial stress and the amount of time and money spent gambling. Anti-authority protesters were significantly more likely to report at least one of these negative life events. And these played an important role in their decision to participate in protests. So results from the qualitative interviews, which I'm not going to go into detail today, showed they were motivated to protest by strong personal grievances based on their personal perceived negative experiences and the deterioration of their personal circumstances. And these were compounded by their perceived or the additional effects of having taken a stance against restrictions or vaccination requirements. Now, this, of course, is not simply an offline in-person movement, and Lydia made this point very clearly. They showed that the anti-government freedom movement was a hybrid movement comprising both online and offline activity. And of course, we know that the pandemic coincided with a rapid spread of disinformation and conspiratorial narratives. Anti-authority protesters were much more likely to say they had intentionally accessed political, ideological, or religious content online that they said mainstream society would describe as fringe, unorthodox, or radical. They were also significantly more likely to intentionally encounter fringe or radical groups, communities, servers, clubs, or forums. Speaking of conspiracy theories, it'll come as no surprise that anti-authority protesters were much more likely to endorse conspiratorial ideologies. More than half believed COVID was part of an orchestrated plan, and nearly just as many believe that vaccines can be used to maliciously infect people with poison or microchips. Overall, support for conspiracy theories was measured using a 7-item scale comprising questions about a range of different conspiracies, not limited to COVID, and measured on a 5-point scale. These items had good internal consistency and an overall mean score was calculated. And as you can see, the mean score for anti-authority protesters was significantly higher than for respondents who had never protested, respondents who had protested but not recently, and respondents who had protested recently but for other causes. What was also interesting is that actually we did some further analysis of first-time protesters, and they in particular were driving the difference. Consistent with the views espoused by conspiracy theorists, anti-authority protesters were more likely to question the results of elections and say they were never counted correctly or fairly. And in reference to Josh's presentation, it'll come as no surprise that anti-authority protesters were significantly more likely to say they agreed with statements that measured alignment with sovereign citizen beliefs. We're obviously particularly interested in perceptions of government, given the focus of the freedom movement on anti-government sentiment. We created a scale to measure perceived legitimacy of politicians, government, and criminal justice system. Was based on 4 items, which measured fairness, respect, transparency, and integrity. And unsurprisingly, levels of perceived legitimacy of politicians, government, and the criminal justice system were significantly lower amongst anti-authority protesters, particularly those who said they never protested before January 2020 for any cause. So, on the basis of these results, we can identify all of the risk and protective factors for cognitive and behavioural radicalisation that were more or less common amongst anti-authority protesters. They were more likely to be male, to attend religious workshop on a regular basis, and to have military service. While rates of mental health problems were similar overall, anti-authority protesters were more likely to say they'd been diagnosed with a personality, psychotic, or substance use disorder. They were more likely to have experienced verbal aggression and physical fights between family members when they were growing up. They were also more likely to say they'd been a recent victim of hate speech or bullying, harassment, and discrimination online. They were more likely to report having intentionally accessed fringe or radical content online and groups, though no more likely to say they'd been exposed to violent media. Consistent with the perception that they were motivated by strong grievances, anti-authority protesters were more likely to report having experienced negative life events in the previous 12 months. They were more likely to endorse conspiracy beliefs. They were less likely to perceive politicians, government, and the criminal justice system as legitimate, indicating lower levels of institutional trust, and were less satisfied with democracy and had a lower respect for our laws. Finally, they were more likely to have a history of juvenile delinquency, adult contact with the criminal justice system, lower levels of self-control, and were more likely to report deviant or radical peers. While this is a useful way of summarising these findings, it doesn't help demonstrate the heterogeneity that exists within the sample. So what we did was a relatively crude measure of the overall number of risk and protective factors that were present, as well as creating what we call a net risk, which is not a risk assessment score, but it's simply the number of risk factors take the number of protective factors present in each respondent. And it's useful for two reasons. First, it shows quite clearly the divergence between our anti-authority protesters and other groups. You can see there's a larger proportion of anti-authority protesters with more risk protectors and more risk factors and fewer protective factors. But it also shows they're not a homogenous group. Many fall well within the range of the other protest groups. Importantly, we didn't just measure risk and protective factors. We also observed that anti-authority protesters were more likely to express that they justified the use of violence in support of their cause, measured using the violence extremism scale. I won't explain that in detail, but it's a 4-item measure that essentially measures the 4-item scale that measures the level of support for violence. We also measured respondents' willingness to participate in illegal or violent political action using the radicalism intention scale, which is another 4-item scale, which first asks respondents to identify a group to which they strongly belong, and then whether they would be willing to engage or support violence by that group. And overall, as you can see, the mean score respondents was significantly higher amongst anti-authority protesters. Now, I think while it's probably enough to show that they have more risk factors, fewer protective factors, and are more likely to support or say they're willing to use violence, we also looked at the relationship between the overall net risk and violence supportive attitudes or willingness to use violence as a final validation of our approach. And what we show is that an increase in net risk was associated with violence supportive attitudes and a readiness to participate in violent action. There was also some tentative evidence that the relationship between net risk and these violence supportive attitudes or willingness to engage in violence was actually strongest for anti-authority protesters. So, to conclude, our results clearly have important implications for responding to individuals and groups who are motivated to protest by grievances, inflamed by conspiratorial ideologies, and who may be willing to use violence in support of their cause. We need to think about how to manage the immediate risk associated with collective action that involves participants or individuals who hold radical attitudes and intentions. But of course, we know that most people who hold extremist beliefs won't act on them. But how does the support and presence influence those who may be motivated to act? And how do we manage this risk without infringing on our fundamental right to protest? The study reinforces the idea that we need to tackle mis and disinformation that may promote harmful anti-government sentiment or anti-democratic sentiment and support for conspiracy beliefs. As others have argued, including in our keynote presentation by Professor Della Porta, we need to make sure there are opportunities to express political dissent and opposition to government authority using lawful mechanisms and not treat all anti-authority protesters as extremists. This means recognising the heterogeneity that exists, as we've illustrated that exists, and responding accordingly. And finally, we need to monitor the evolution of social movements. Of course, we're hopefully beyond the pandemic, or at least the worst of it, and an increasingly polarised political environment. Knowing whether certain social movements are supported by individuals who may be vulnerable to radicalisation, it has important implications for how we respond. Extremist movements and actors who drive them continue to evolve and seek to capitalise on contemporary social and political movements. I will end it there, hopefully within the 20 minutes. Thank you.